Hugh Laurie was the face of House, a character who became iconic for his brilliance and razor-sharp wit. But behind the scenes, the actor himself was spiraling into a darkness as deep and complex as the one he portrayed on screen. With each season, Laurie's struggle with depression intensified, his life slowly intertwining with the cynical, tormented doctor he embodied. What began as a role of a lifetime became a personal battle for survival, and Laurie would soon find himself facing an internal struggle far beyond anything written into the script. When Hugh Laurie first landed the role of Dr. Gregory House, he had no idea just how profound an impact it would have on his life. He saw House as an extraordinary opportunity, a challenging role that any actor would dream of. With his piercing wit and unconventional methods, Dr. House was a character unlike any Laurie had encountered. However, as he delved into the complexities of the brilliant yet tortured physician, Laurie found himself pulled into a darker place, one that blurred the line between character and self. In the early days, the rush of filming fueled him. He threw himself fully into Dr. House, determined to make the character believable, relatable, and unforgettable. He mastered House's biting sarcasm, his bitterness, and his barely concealed pain. The show became a runaway hit, captivating millions and launching Laurie's career into a new level of fame. Yet, as the weeks turned into months and the seasons piled up, Laurie started feeling the emotional toll in ways he hadn't anticipated. Behind the scenes, his dedication became a double-edged sword. The grueling schedule left him working 14-hour days, often 6 days a week. He felt trapped in the role, bound to a man who was as complex as he was broken. The more Laurie embodied Dr. House's struggles, the more he felt those struggles seeping into his own life. Colleagues praised his performance, but they didn't see the emotional weight that he was carrying home each night. Even when the camera stopped, he found it hard to shake off the character's darkness. The cynicism and loneliness of Dr. House began to feel too real. At first, Laurie dismissed these feelings as just part of the job, thinking he could ignore them. After all, actors sometimes had to carry the emotional baggage of their characters. But as time went on, he felt himself sinking further, the divide between Hugh and House blurring. The usual distractions didn't work anymore. He stopped feeling joy in the things he used to love: music, comedy, even time with his family. He started questioning his abilities, wondering if he could ever separate himself from this character who had so fully taken over his life. On set, he isolated himself, sitting alone during breaks, lost in thought. Friends and family started noticing that he was becoming more withdrawn, his usually quick sense of humor fading into silence. He would stare at his reflection, sometimes seeing only Dr. House looking back, a man burdened by unspoken pain. Despite his growing exhaustion, he convinced himself that he had to push through. After all, millions of fans were tuning in each week to watch him. Quitting wasn't an option. The fame and admiration from viewers only intensified the guilt he felt for struggling with what he assumed was just stress. Yet, as season after season passed, he began to realize that this wasn't something he could ignore forever. The weight of the character, the expectations, and his own deteriorating mental state were wearing him down. A part of him knew he couldn't keep going like this, but he didn't know how to talk about what he was experiencing. After all, what would people think if they knew Hugh Laurie, the successful, celebrated star of House, was wrestling with depression? Unaware at the time, this was only the beginning of a much deeper internal battle that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself. As Hugh Laurie settled into his role on House, his internal struggle intensified. With each new season, the walls seemed to close in tighter. Every day, he slipped deeper into the mental state of Dr. Gregory House, the brilliant but broken doctor who hid his pain behind a mask of sarcasm and indifference. But when the camera stopped rolling, Laurie found he could no longer shake off the character's darkness. It clung to him, following him home, consuming his thoughts, and casting a shadow over every aspect of his life. On the outside, Laurie's career was at an all-time high. Viewers were captivated by his performance, and his portrayal of House had become iconic. But inside, Laurie felt empty, disconnected from the world and from himself. He began to feel as though he was losing control, unable to separate his own emotions from the weight of the character he portrayed. In moments of solitude, he found himself questioning his own worth, plagued by a persistent feeling of inadequacy that he couldn't quite explain. He began to doubt himself, wondering if he even deserved the success he had achieved. Laurie tried to manage on his own, but the depression deepened. Nights were the hardest. Exhausted from endless hours on set, he would lie awake in the dark, his mind racing with self-doubt and guilt. No amount of fame or praise could quiet the gnawing ache within him. He started to resent the character he once loved, feeling trapped in the role that had, ironically, brought him both fortune and isolation. The boundary between Hugh and House was dissolving, leaving him feeling more alone than ever. His colleagues, friends, and family sensed that something was wrong, but Laurie kept his suffering to himself, convinced that no one would understand. He feared that admitting his depression would shatter the illusion of strength he had built over the years. His British upbringing made him believe that sharing such personal struggles was a sign of weakness, and so he buried his pain, concealing it beneath a composed exterior. The unrelenting schedule of House only made things worse. Each season brought new storylines, higher stakes, and a heavier burden. Laurie was constantly on set, immersed in the character's troubled world. He became increasingly isolated, withdrawing from those around him and distancing himself emotionally. Even when surrounded by cast and crew, he felt like an outsider, haunted by an invisible weight that no one else could see. To cope, he began to adopt House's traits in real life: his cynicism, his sarcasm, his emotional detachment. The more he became like House, the more trapped he felt. Every morning became a battle just to get out of bed, and each day on set felt like a marathon he wasn't sure he could finish. He would look in the mirror and see House's tired, haunted eyes staring back at him. Hugh Laurie, the man, was slipping away, leaving only a shell of himself, the brilliant but broken doctor everyone expected him to be. He felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility to keep going, to keep giving the audience the performance they expected. He told himself he had no right to feel this way, not when so many people adored his work. Yet, the more he tried to push through, the more suffocating his depression became. He was trapped in a role that felt inescapable, each day pushing him further into a place he feared he might never return from. In those quiet, solitary moments, Laurie knew he was standing on the edge of something dangerous. But he didn't know how to ask for help. He didn't know how to admit that he too was suffering, that he too was in pain. The silence became unbearable, his inner turmoil like a storm raging just beneath the surface. And as he braced himself to continue, somewhere inside, he began to wonder if there was a way out. For Hugh Laurie, the years spent portraying Dr. House had taken him to the darkest corners of his own mind. But it was a simple realization that finally began to pull him back. He didn't have to face this alone. After years of silent suffering, a moment of clarity dawned. Laurie began to understand that if he continued ignoring the toll of depression, he might lose himself entirely. He'd spent too long carrying the weight of his character's pain alongside his own, and it was time to let someone else in. Reaching out for help didn't come naturally to him. Laurie, like so many, had grown up with the belief that personal struggles should remain private. Yet, as he looked around, he saw others in the entertainment industry starting to open up about their mental health challenges. This gave him a sense of permission, a reassurance that he wasn't alone in his experience. Finally, he confided in those close to him, friends, family, and even some of the cast and crew who had worked with him on House. Laurie began to see that they hadn't been blind to his struggles. They had noticed his growing isolation and fatigue, but hadn't known how to help him if he wasn't willing to let them in. Therapy became a turning point, helping Laurie separate himself from the role of Dr. House and reconnect with his true self. In his sessions, he began to unpack the thoughts that had haunted him during his time on the show, acknowledging the toll that embodying such a complex, tormented character had taken on him. He started to recognize that his depression wasn't a sign of weakness, but rather a response to years of internalized stress, isolation, and self-doubt. With each session, Laurie took another step away from Dr. House's cynicism and emotional detachment, rediscovering his own voice and sense of humor that had been dulled by years of internal turmoil. He allowed himself to feel again, to find joy in the little things, to laugh genuinely and without reservation. Gradually, he reconnected with friends and family, letting them see the man behind the character, the Hugh Laurie who could be vulnerable, who needed support, who was, above all, human. When Laurie finally felt ready, he chose to speak publicly about his experience with depression. It wasn't an easy decision, but he knew that sharing his journey could make a difference for others who might be struggling in silence. In interviews, he was candid, admitting that, for years, he had felt trapped, overwhelmed, and ashamed of his own feelings. But he also spoke of the importance of seeking help, of allowing oneself to be vulnerable, and of understanding that mental health was just as essential as physical well-being. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Fans, colleagues, and strangers reached out, thanking him for his courage, for putting into words what so many felt but feared to say. Laurie's openness about his mental health became a beacon for those who had felt alone in their own struggles. In speaking out, he helped dismantle the stigma surrounding depression, showing that anyone, regardless of status or success, could face mental health challenges, and that seeking help was a sign of strength, not weakness. For Laurie, the journey to recovery was ongoing. But as he moved forward, he carried with him a renewed sense of purpose. His story had transcended the screen, impacting lives far beyond what he'd ever imagined. He had become not just an actor admired for his talent, but an advocate for mental health, a voice for compassion, and a reminder that vulnerability could lead to healing. Looking back, he saw his years on House, not just as a time of personal struggle, but as the beginning of a profound transformation. Hugh Laurie had found his way out of the darkness, not by hiding, but by embracing his humanity, by breaking the silence, and by learning, as he shared with the world, that sometimes the strongest thing one can do is ask for help.